Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound of a quill on parchment echoes through the study like a death sentence being signed in slow motion. Jonathan Fairmont dips his pen again, the ink pooling black as tar, and writes words that will echo across 3 centuries. The slave woman Sarah has demonstrated knowledge of herbal remedies. Proved useful with overseer's illness. May serve household purposes. He doesn't know it yet, but he's just signed her death warrant. The year is 1731, and the air inside the Fairmont plantation house hangs thick, not just with Carolina humidity, but with something darker. Money. Ambition. The particular rot that comes from building paradise on other people's bones. Outside those cypress wood walls, 63 human beings labor in rice fields where the water reaches their thighs and the sun can drop a man in 2 hours. Inside, Jonathan Fairmont sits at his imported English desk, surrounded by furniture built by enslaved hands that will never sign their own names to anything. He's 29 years old. Educated at the College of William and Mary. The kind of man who reads philosophy at night and counts human beings like cattle in the morning. He inherited this plantation, this house, those 63 souls from his father, along with the weight of expectation that comes with being a second son who needs to prove himself worthy of the legacy. His wife Catherine is upstairs, coughing. Always coughing. She's been sick since summer, that persistent hack that shakes her thin frame and leaves blood specks on the handkerchiefs the house slaves burn in secret. She's 16 years old, was 16 when they married in an arrangement between families, the way you'd arrange a shipment of tobacco or rice. The daughter of a Charleston merchant whose fortune flows from the triangular trade. That polite term for horror. Dr. Archibald Hayes has been treating her for months. Bleeding her. Purging her. Prescribing tonics that cost £3 sterling and accomplish exactly nothing except emptying Jonathan's purse. Catherine grows thinner. The cough grows worse. And Jonathan grows desperate. Which brings us back to that ledger entry. May serve household purposes. Those 4 words transform Sarah from field worker to something far more dangerous. Valuable property. In Jonathan's world, there are only 2 kinds of enslaved people. Those who work the fields and die anonymous, and those who become indispensable. The indispensable ones get better food, private rooms, exemption from the worst labor. They also get watched more closely, controlled more tightly. Because property that knows its own worth is property that might start getting ideas. Jonathan blows on the ink to dry it, closes the leather-bound ledger, and leans back in his chair. Through the window, he can see the geometric patterns of his rice fields stretching toward the river, those engineered waterways that turned swampland into gold. 800 acres of it. His father's legacy. His burden. His opportunity to prove himself. Upstairs, Catherine coughs again. The sound carries through the floorboards like an accusation. He doesn't see Sarah as human. He can't afford to. In his world, in 1731 South Carolina, seeing enslaved people as fully human would mean confronting the foundation his entire life is built on. So instead, he sees her as a tool. A newly discovered resource. Something that might save his wife's life and, more importantly, save him from the humiliation of losing her to an illness that even expensive doctors can't cure. What he doesn't understand, what he'll never understand until it's too late, is that Sarah's gift isn't just about mixing herbs and roots. Her real power is that she pays attention. She watches. She listens. She sees what's actually happening instead of what people assume is happening. And in a world built on assumptions about who deserves to live and who deserves to suffer, that kind of clarity is more dangerous than any poison. The quill rests in its holder now. The ink dries. The words become permanent. And somewhere in the slave quarters behind the main house, Sarah has no idea that her ability to heal has just made her a target. Because here's the thing about being valuable property in 1731 South Carolina. Your worth protects you right up until the moment it threatens someone more powerful than you. Then your worth becomes the very thing they'll use to destroy you. Jonathan Fairmont just wrote her value into the official record. He thought he was documenting a useful discovery. He was actually lighting the fuse. Before we continue, I need to ask you something. If you're listening from anywhere in the Deep South, or from any corner of this country where hidden histories still whisper through the walls of old buildings, leave a comment telling me where you're from. This channel survives because of listeners like you who hunger for the truth that history tried to bury. Hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear has never been told in full. And stories like this deserve to be remembered. The slave quarters sit in 2 neat rows behind the main house, far enough for white propriety, close enough for immediate summons. 16 small cabins built from rough-cut pine, each one housing 4 to 6 people in a space barely large enough for 2. No windows, just gaps between the boards that let in mosquitoes and morning light in equal measure. Dirt floors that turn to mud when it rains. A single communal fire pit where people gather after the work bell rings at sunset. This is where real life happens. Thomas sits on a stump near the fire, unwrapping the cloth from his left hand with a wince that he tries to hide. The other field workers watch without seeming to watch. That particular skill enslaved people develop early, the art of paying attention while appearing not to notice anything at all. His hand looks like death spreading in slow motion. The cut from the oyster shell happened 3 days ago while he was repairing one of the trunk gates that control water flow into the rice fields. A simple accident. The kind of thing that happens when you're working 12-hour days in waterlogged fields full of sharp edges. But in this heat, in this humidity, in water that's half river and half sewage from the rice processing, simple cuts don't stay simple. The wound has turned the color of spoiled meat, angry red, bleeding into black at the edges. It weeps a yellow fluid that smells like copper and rot. Thomas can feel the infection crawling up his forearm, hot and poisonous, turning the veins into dark lines under his skin. Duncan McLeese, the Scottish overseer, noted it in his work log this morning. Thomas saw him write it down. Thomas, hand infection, monitor. Not, Thomas needs a doctor. Not, Thomas requires immediate treatment. Just monitor, the way you'd monitor livestock to see if it's worth the expense of intervention, or if you should just let nature take its course and replace it. A dead slave costs money, but so does a doctor's time. And Thomas isn't quite expensive enough to justify the expense. Not yet. Sarah emerges from her cabin as the sun drops below the tree line, painting the sky the color of old blood. She's tall, taller than most of the men, and moves with a kind of deliberate precision that makes people step aside without quite knowing why. She wears the same rough gray dress as every other enslaved woman on the plantation, but around her neck hangs something different, a small leather pouch, worn smooth from years of handling, tied with a cord that might have been red once but has faded to rust. She doesn't speak. Doesn't need to. Thomas extends his hand, and she kneels beside him in the dirt without hesitation. Her fingers are cooler than they should be in this heat. They probe the wound with a gentleness that makes Thomas's throat tighten, because gentleness is rare here, and when you encounter it, the contrast is almost unbearable. She presses carefully around the infection, watching how the darkness spreads, how the skin responds, how deep the poison has traveled. How long? Her voice is quiet. Northern accent. Virginia, maybe, or farther up the coast. The kind of voice that's learned when to speak and when silence is safer. 3 days, Thomas says. Maybe 4. Sarah nods once, stands, and disappears into the woods beyond the quarters without another word. The others wait. Nobody asks where she's going or what she's doing. There's a communication network here that operates entirely without words, in glances, in the tilt of a head, in who sits where around the evening fire. Information travels through this network faster than it travels through the main house, more accurately than anything written in overseer logs or plantation ledgers. They know Sarah has a gift. They don't call it that out loud, because naming things gives them power and power draws attention. But they know. She sees things in plants that others walk past without noticing. She understands the language of fevers and infections and pain in ways that the expensive white doctors with their Edinburgh degrees never will. An hour passes. The fire burns lower. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls through the cypress trees. Sarah returns carrying a handful of what looks like common weeds to anyone who doesn't know better. But these aren't random plants, they're specific leaves from specific trees, roots dug from specific spots where the soil composition is exactly right, stems cut at precisely the right stage of growth. She settles beside the fire and begins working with a focus so complete that the world around her seems to fade. Using a flat stone she's worn smooth over years, she crushes certain leaves into paste, their green flesh breaking down to release oils that catch the firelight. The smell is sharp, medicinal, almost bitter, but underneath that bitterness is something else. Something that smells like possibility. She mixes the paste with clean water from the well, not the brackish stuff from the river. Adds a pinch of something from her leather pouch. Powder so fine it could be dirt, or could be ground root, or could be knowledge accumulated over generations. She works the mixture with her fingers until it reaches the exact consistency she needs, neither too wet nor too dry. Then she binds it against Thomas's wound with strips of cloth torn from her own spare dress. 3 days, she says. The black should retreat. Keep it clean. Keep it dry. Don't let McLeese bleed you if he offers. You need your strength, not less of it. Thomas nods. Around the fire, others watch this small miracle of attention and care. Tomorrow, Sarah will return to whatever work she's been assigned, hauling water, maybe, or working in Catherine Fairmont's garden, or any of the 100 tasks that fill the days. But tonight, in this moment, she's something else entirely. She's someone who sees them as worth saving. The paste is cool against Thomas's hot skin. The infection throbs with its own poisonous heartbeat. But already, or maybe it's just hope, the pain seems less sharp, the heat less intense. Sarah washes her hands in the water bucket, dries them on her dress, and stands. She doesn't wait for thanks. Doesn't expect it. This isn't about gratitude or recognition. This is about something more fundamental. The quiet insistence that their lives matter, that their suffering deserves attention, that they are human beings worthy of care even in a world built on denying that basic truth. She returns to her cabin. The leather pouch swings at her neck, catching the last of the firelight. Behind her, Thomas sits with his hand bound in healing herbs, surrounded by people who've witnessed this small act of defiance disguised as medicine. Because that's what it is, really, defiance. The assertion that their knowledge has value, that their traditions matter, that they possess skills and wisdom that their enslavers can never take away, no matter how many ledgers they write or how many bills of sale they sign. In 3 days, the infection will retreat. In a week, the wound will close. In 2 weeks, Thomas will grip an axe handle without wincing. And word will spread through the quarters, that careful, coded communication that keeps them alive and connected. Sarah can heal. Sarah has the gift. Sarah sees what others miss. They don't know yet that this gift will nearly kill her. They don't know that her healing hands will be called witchcraft. They don't know that within 17 years she'll be locked in a cell, condemned to burn, and facing an impossible choice between death and an escape that shouldn't be possible. Tonight, all they know is that one of their own is suffering less. And in a world designed to maximize their suffering, even that small mercy feels like revolution. The fire burns down to embers. People drift back to their cabins. Thomas stays a moment longer, staring at his wrapped hand, feeling the coolness of the poultice working against the infection's heat. And somewhere in the main house, Jonathan Fairmont sleeps soundly, believing he's discovered a useful tool. He has no idea he's just witnessed the beginning of a legend. Duncan Maclise doesn't believe in weakness. The Scottish overseer built his reputation on being harder than the men he supervises, tougher than the climate, meaner than the mosquitoes that swarm the rice fields at dusk. He rides his horse through the plantation like a general surveying conquered territory, his voice carrying across the waterlogged fields with commands that brook no argument. Which is why, when he collapses in his small house near the rice mill, clutching his stomach and retching into a bucket, it sends a ripple of unease through the entire plantation. It's July now, the worst of the Carolina summer. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and turns breathing into work. Maclise has been sick for 2 days, his body racked with cramps so severe he can't mount his horse. His assistant sends a messenger racing toward Georgetown, 20 miles through humidity so thick you could cut it with a blade. Dr. Archibald Hayes is attending a difficult childbirth in the opposite direction. Won't be available for at least 3 days, maybe more. The messenger returns with this news and a shrug that says, "What can you do?" In the main house, Catherine Fairmont sits in the parlor, embroidering with shaking hands, while Betty, one of the house slaves who moves through rooms like furniture, seen but not really noticed, clears away the afternoon tea service. Jonathan paces by the window, watching the fields where work has slowed to a crawl without Maclise's constant supervision. Every hour the overseer stays incapacitated costs him money. Time is money. Labor is money. Control is money. Ma'am. Betty's voice is so quiet it almost disappears into the afternoon heat. Catherine looks up from her embroidery, squinting. Her eyesight has been failing lately, another symptom of her general decline. Betty doesn't look directly at her. That would be improper, possibly dangerous. Instead, she keeps her eyes lowered, her voice carefully neutral. There's a woman in the quarters. Sarah. She knows about sickness. Helped Thomas when his hand went bad. Could help Mr. Maclise, if... She stops, the sentence dangling. The unspoken words hang in the air like humidity. If you'd consider asking a slave for medical help. If you'd admit that someone like her might know something your expensive doctor doesn't. Catherine's needle pauses mid-stitch. She's 16 years old, raised in Charleston society where black people exist to serve and white people exist to be served, and never shall those categories blur. But she's also watched her husband spend a small fortune on Dr. Hayes while her own health steadily declines. She's young, but she's not stupid. Fetch her, Catherine says, and Betty disappears before the words finish leaving her mouth. Sarah stands in Maclise's doorway 20 minutes later, taking in everything with those observant eyes that make people uncomfortable. The room stinks of vomit and sweat and fear. Maclise lies on his narrow bed, curled on his side, face gray as ash. His breath comes in shallow gasps. She steps closer without being invited. In the corner, Maclise's assistant watches nervously, hand resting on the pistol at his belt, because you never know with slaves, especially ones who get ideas above their station. Sarah doesn't ask permission to examine him. She simply does. Her cool fingers press against his fevered forehead, his distended stomach, the pulse point at his neck. She pulls down his lower eyelid, checking the color. Sniffs near his mouth, detecting something in his breath that tells her what she needs to know. What did he eat yesterday? Her voice is matter-of-fact, clinical. The assistant stammers through a list: salt pork, corn mush, some fish from the river. And water? Where from? The well. Near the rice mill. Sarah nods once, as if confirming something she already suspected. Brackish water. It's making him sick. That well's too close to the rice fields. The processing runoff contaminates it. She doesn't wait for argument. She's already moving toward the door, listing what she needs. Clean water from the main house well, specific bark from specific trees, roots that grow in dry soil away from the marsh. By evening, she's prepared a tea that smells sharp and medicinal. She makes McLeese drink it despite his protests, then prepares a second mixture that she instructs be given every 4 hours through the night. No solid food for 2 days, she says. Only clean water and this tea. The cramps will ease by tomorrow morning. McLeese, too weak to argue, too desperate to refuse, drinks the bitter liquid and curses her under his breath in Gaelic. Jonathan Fairmont stands in his study 3 days later, staring at another ledger entry he's about to write. McLeese is back on his horse, shouting orders across the fields. The plantation has returned to its profitable rhythm. He dips his quill, hesitates. The slave woman Sarah has demonstrated knowledge of herbal remedies. Proved useful with overseer's illness. May serve household purposes. The words should feel like documentation of a useful discovery. Instead, they feel like a confession. He's just admitted, in writing, in permanent ink, that an enslaved woman succeeded where his expensive doctor would have failed. That someone he owns, someone he considers property, possesses knowledge that exceeds the educated men of his class. His hand trembles slightly as he signs his name below the entry. Gratitude and resentment churn together in his gut like sour milk. He's grateful McLeese survived. He's resentful that he owes that survival to Sarah. Most of all, he's deeply, fundamentally uncomfortable with the implication that the natural order he takes for granted, white over black, educated over ignorant, owner over owned, might not reflect actual competence. That discomfort will fester, will grow, will eventually demand satisfaction. But tonight, he simply closes the ledger and pours himself a brandy, trying not to think about the fact that he just trusted his plantation's survival to someone he'd sell tomorrow if the price was right. Upstairs, Catherine coughs. That persistent, racking cough that's been getting worse for months. Jonathan drains his glass and pours another. By September, Catherine can barely leave her bed. What started as a minor irritation has become a symphony of suffering. The cough shakes her thin frame so violently that Jonathan can hear it from his study 2 rooms away. She's lost so much weight that her collarbones jut out like broken wings beneath her nightgown. Blood specks the handkerchiefs she coughs into, tiny crimson flowers that Betty burns in the kitchen fireplace before anyone can ask questions. Dr. Archibald Hayes has been treating her since summer. He's bled her 3 times, purged her twice, and prescribed an expensive tonic of his own invention that he claims is based on the latest European medical science. It cost £3 sterling. It accomplished nothing except lightening Jonathan's purse and darkening Catherine's already pale complexion. The humors are severely imbalanced, Hayes pronounces during his weekly visit, adjusting his spectacles in that way that makes him look learned and authoritative. We must continue the bleeding to release the corrupted blood. Another purge should follow. And complete bed rest with windows sealed against drafts. Night air is particularly dangerous for consumption. Jonathan nods, because what else can he do? This is Dr. Archibald Hayes, trained at Edinburgh University, respected across 2 colonies. This is the best medical care money can buy. And it's killing his wife. Betty makes the suggestion again, quieter this time, more desperate. Ma'am, please. Sarah helped Mr. McLeese. She could. Fetch her, Catherine whispers, her voice barely audible over her labored breathing. This time, Jonathan is present when Sarah enters the bedroom. He stands in the corner, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral, though his jaw is clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Sarah stands in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the scene with those unervingly perceptive eyes. Windows closed and curtained despite the suffocating heat. Chamber pot in the corner that reeks of infection. Catherine's skin the color of old parchment, damp with fever sweat. Her breathing shallow and rapid, each inhale a visible struggle. Sarah steps closer to the bed, places her hand on Catherine's forehead, then her chest, then her back, feeling for something invisible, listening for something only she can hear. She needs air, Sarah says finally, her voice clear and certain. Clean air. The windows must open. Jonathan stiffens. Dr. Hayes explicitly stated that drafts would worsen her condition. Sarah turns to look at him directly, and this is the moment that will haunt Jonathan for years. This moment when an enslaved woman meets his eyes without deference, without fear, with nothing but absolute conviction in her own knowledge. The physician is wrong. The words hang in the air like gun smoke. Jonathan feels his face flush hot. The audacity, the disrespect, the fundamental violation of every social contract that structures his world. She's not just contradicting a doctor, she's contradicting the entire hierarchy that places educated white men at the top and enslaved black women at the bottom. But Catherine is dying. He can hear it in her breathing, can see it in the way her chest heaves with effort, can smell it in the sickness that pervades the room. "Open the windows," he says, his voice tight. Betty moves immediately, throwing back the curtains and unlatching the windows. Fresh air floods the room, carrying with it the smell of the river, the rice fields, the salt marsh. Catherine gasps, not from distress, but from relief, breathing deeply for the first time in weeks. Sarah returns that evening with bundles of plants wrapped in cloth. She takes over the kitchen, scandalizing the cook who's ruled that domain for years. Boils water. Steeps leaves and roots in careful proportions, creating a tea that smells of mint and something sharper, almost medicinal. She makes Catherine drink it 3 times daily. Mixes a paste that's applied to Catherine's chest and back before sleep. Most importantly, she insists Catherine sit outside on the piazza for 2 hours each morning and evening, breathing the river air that Dr. Hayes claimed would kill her. When Hayes learns of this treatment, he arrives at the plantation in a fury. "You're allowing a slave's superstitions to endanger your wife's life." He stands in Jonathan's study, face red, voice shaking with indignation. "I studied at Edinburgh University. I've treated patients across 2 continents. And you trust some hedge-witch knowledge over established medical science." Jonathan says nothing, just watches through the window where Catherine sits on the piazza, breathing deeply, looking more alive than she has in months. 3 weeks later, Catherine walks downstairs to dinner. 4 weeks later, her cough has diminished to occasional clearing. 6 weeks later, she asks for her sewing basket. The miracle spreads through Georgetown society like wildfire through dry grass. The Fairmont slave who saved Catherine's life becomes the sensation of parlor conversations. Not because anyone truly understands what happened. Understanding would require acknowledging that Sarah's knowledge might be real, systematic, superior to their expensive doctors. Instead, they frame it as curiosity. An amusing anecdote. A lucky accident of plantation folk remedies that happened to work this one time. They strip it of meaning, of challenge, of threat. Because the alternative, that an enslaved woman might be brilliant, that traditional African knowledge might exceed European medicine, that the people they own might possess wisdom they lack, that alternative is too dangerous to contemplate. So they tell the story at dinner parties as entertainment, as oddity. as something remarkable but ultimately unthreatening to the order of things. They turned Sarah's genius into a parlor trick. And Sarah, who saved Catherine's life through observation, knowledge, and skill that took years to develop, returns to the slave quarters knowing that her greatest achievement will be remembered as their amusing story. Jonathan stands in his study, watching Catherine laugh at something across the dinner table. Actually laugh, a sound he thought he'd never hear again. He owes this woman everything, and he'll never, ever forgive her for it. The notches start appearing on a small piece of wood Sarah keeps hidden beneath the loose floorboard in her cabin. 1 mark for each person treated. A vertical line for survival. A horizontal scratch for death, though those are rare, thank God, and she whispers prayers over each one in languages her mother taught her, languages that have no written form but live in the body's memory. By the fall of 1732, she's carved 11 marks. All vertical, all living. Her fame spreads through Georgetown society the way water seeps through rice field levees, slowly at first, then all at once. Rebecca Thornton sends word through her husband that she'd like to borrow the Fairmont healing woman for her infant son who's developed a fever that 3 doctors can't break. Samuel Hartwell's plantation manager arrives with a formal letter requesting Sarah's services for his employer's persistent headaches. And Colleton's family negotiates terms for Sarah to treat the elderly matriarch everyone assumes won't survive winter. These aren't requests. They're transactions. Jonathan Fairmont doesn't loan Sarah out of generosity. He charges for her time the way he'd charge for renting his rice mill or his blacksmith services. £2 per week, plus compensation for lost labor at Fairmont. Sarah becomes a revenue stream, her knowledge monetized and distributed through the same economic networks that bought and sold her body. She travels in wagons between plantations, always accompanied by an overseer or trusted slave who ensures she doesn't run. The irony would be funny if it weren't so crushing. They need her skills desperately enough to move her across the countryside, but trust her so little they chain her at night when she stays at distant properties. At the Thornton plantation, she saves the infant by recognizing that his fever comes from contaminated milk, not supernatural causes. The wet nurse has mastitis, infection passing through breast milk to the baby. Sarah treats both mother and child, and within days the fever breaks. Rebecca Thornton weeps with gratitude and gives Sarah a scrap of blue cloth as thanks, a gift that means everything and nothing simultaneously. At the Hartwell estate, she discovers Samuel's headaches stem from the lead-based paint used in his study, where he spends 12 hours daily managing his businesses. She can't remove the paint, that's not her place to suggest. So instead she prepares a tea that helps his body process the poison more efficiently and recommends he work elsewhere when possible. The headaches diminish. Samuel considers it a miracle. Sarah considers it paying attention. In the slave quarters at Fairmont, her success creates fractures that nobody talks about openly but everyone feels. She has her own cabin now, a single room, a luxury unimaginable for field workers who sleep 4 to a space this size. She receives extra food rations because Jonathan has decided her health is an investment worth protecting. She's exempt from field labor, her hands kept soft for healing work rather than being destroyed by rice cultivation. The other enslaved people watch this elevation with emotions too complex for simple names. Pride, because one of their own has proven their worth in terms even white people must acknowledge. Resentment, because Sarah's privileges highlight their own continued suffering. Fear, because anything that makes you valuable also makes you vulnerable in ways that field workers, anonymous, interchangeable, are not. She tries to bridge the distance. Continues treating people in the quarters without charge, using the same care she gives wealthy white patients. Shares her extra food. Teaches others what she knows about healing plants, though quietly, carefully, because knowledge is dangerous when you're not supposed to have any. But the distance grows anyway, carved by the system itself. She moves between worlds now, summoned to main houses that smell of beeswax candles and imported tea, where the floors are polished cypress and the furniture bears the signatures of European craftsmen. Then back to the quarters that smell of earth and wood smoke and the herbs she hangs to dry from her cabin's rafters, where floors are packed dirt and furniture consists of whatever can be built from scraps. The scent of the main houses clings to her clothes. Lavender soap. Furniture polish. The particular mustiness of leather-bound books. When she returns to the quarters, she smells foreign, contaminated by proximity to wealth. She scrubs her hands and face with harsh lye soap, trying to wash away the association, but the invisible mark remains. At night, alone in her cabin, she adds another notch to her hidden piece of wood. 13 marks now. 15. 20. Each one a life preserved, a small victory against a system designed to treat human beings as disposable. She doesn't see the trap she's walking into. Doesn't understand that every success makes certain people more desperate to destroy her. Doesn't realize that in a world built on hierarchy, competence in the wrong person isn't celebrated, it's threatening. The leather pouch around her neck grows heavier with accumulated knowledge. Seeds and roots and dried flowers gathered from a dozen plantations, each location offering plants with slightly different properties depending on soil and sunlight. She's building a comprehensive understanding of low-country medicine, empirical and systematic, that would impress any European naturalist if they could see past the color of her skin. But they can't. They won't. To them, she's either lucky or uncanny, and neither explanation allows for the possibility that she's simply brilliant. By the spring of 1733, she's treated 26 people. 26 notches, all vertical. 26 lives that would have ended under standard medical care but continued because someone paid attention to what was actually happening instead of what textbooks claimed should happen. She kneels in her cabin, running her thumb over the notched wood, and whispers names. Thomas. Catherine. The Thornton baby. Samuel Hartwell. And Colleton's mother. Each mark represents a person, not a number. Each survival is a small act of resistance against a world that insists certain people don't matter. She doesn't know that in 15 years, this gift will put her in a cell awaiting execution. Doesn't know that the same hands that heal will be called instruments of Satan. Doesn't know that her greatest achievement, keeping people alive, will be reframed as evidence of supernatural evil. Tonight, she only knows that her back aches from travel, her heart aches from isolation, and somewhere out there, someone else is suffering who might benefit from what she knows. She replaces the notched wood beneath the floorboard, covers it with dirt, and lies down on her narrow bed. Tomorrow, she'll be borrowed again, transported again, valued and devalued simultaneously, her humanity acknowledged only insofar as it serves someone else's needs. This is what it means to have a gift in a world that doesn't believe you should exist. Dr. Archibald Hayes maintains an office on Front Street in Georgetown, above a merchant's shop that sells imported fabrics and rum. The sign outside reads, Dr. A. Hayes, physician and surgeon, trained at Edinburgh University. That last detail is crucial. It establishes him as a man of science, educated in the great centers of European learning, bearer of knowledge tested by centuries of medical tradition. The office smells of leather and tobacco, and something faintly medicinal that might be laudanum, or might just be the accumulated scent of decades of bloodletting. His desk is mahogany, imported at considerable expense. His instruments are brass and steel, kept in a locked cabinet. His diploma hangs prominently on the wall, its Latin script impressive to patients who can't read Latin but understand that official-looking documents confer authority. He's 47 years old. Never married. Built his practice over 20 years through a combination of genuine skill and strategic flattery of wealthy families. He's not a bad doctor by 1733 standards. He's thorough, reads the latest medical journals from London, and his mortality rate is probably no worse than average for the era. But he's also expensive. Very expensive. And lately, an uncomfortable number of his wealthiest patients have been whispering about alternative treatments. The Fairmont slave. The woman with the herbs. The one who saved Catherine when Hayes's own treatments were failing. He hears about it at dinner parties, in carefully casual conversations. Our overseer fell ill, and the strangest thing, Jonathan's healing woman fixed him right up with some sort of tea. Or, my infant son had a fever that wouldn't break, and this enslaved healer from Fairmont did something with plants, and now he's perfectly healthy. They frame it as curiosity, amusement. But underneath the polite veneer, Hayes hears the real message. Your treatments cost £3 sterling and accomplished nothing. Her remedies cost nothing and worked perfectly. In October of 1733, he loses the Hartwell account. Samuel Hartwell, who's been paying Hayes a quarterly retainer for ongoing care, sends a polite letter explaining that his health has improved remarkably under alternative management, and he'll no longer require Hayes's services. Hayes knows exactly what alternative management means. He sits in his office that evening, decanter of brandy on his desk, and faces an uncomfortable truth. He's being replaced. Not by another educated physician, not by a competitor with better credentials or newer techniques, but by an enslaved woman who works for free and whose knowledge comes from God knows where. It's not just about money, though the money matters. It's about authority, about the natural order, about the fundamental assumption that educated white men possess knowledge that uneducated black women cannot possibly match. If Sarah's remedies work better than his, and the evidence increasingly suggests they do, then what does that say about his expensive education? About the entire edifice of European medical science? About the hierarchy that places him at the top and her at the bottom? He pours another brandy and makes a private pledge, speaking aloud to the empty office. She's a hedge witch. A lucky peasant who stumbled on a few folk remedies that happen to work occasionally. Nothing more. And I will prove it. The plan forms slowly, fueled by resentment and brandy. He can't attack her directly. She's property, and criticizing another man's property is delicate business. But he can plant seeds, suggest concerns, use the language of medicine and religion to frame her success not as competence but as something darker. How does she know which plants to use? Where did this knowledge come from? Isn't it peculiar how effective her treatments are, almost unnaturally so? He begins mentioning these concerns in careful conversations with influential patients. Not accusations exactly, just questions. The kind of questions that make people uncomfortable, that activate existing prejudices, that transform admiration into suspicion. At the Fairmont plantation, Catherine sits in the parlor working on embroidery while Jonathan reviews ledgers. Between them, in a wooden cradle carved by enslaved hands, their son Benjamin sleeps peacefully. He was born in January of 1743, after Catherine had suffered 2 miscarriages that nearly killed her. She was 28 years old when she finally carried a pregnancy to term, and the labor lasted 19 hours. Sarah attended the birth, not as primary midwife. That role went to a white woman from Georgetown considered proper for such occasions, but as assistant, preparing the teas and compresses that eased Catherine's pain and prevented infection afterward. Benjamin is 5 months old now. Healthy, alert, a child whose very existence feels like a miracle after so many years of Catherine's fragile health and failed pregnancies. He has Jonathan's dark hair and Catherine's pale complexion, and when he smiles, both parents see the future. A son to inherit the plantation, to carry forward the Fairmont name, to justify everything they've built. He'll go to William and Mary like you did, Catherine says softly, not looking up from her embroidery. Learn to manage the property properly. Make something even greater of it. Jonathan nods, but doesn't speak. He's calculating numbers, the cost of education, the projected value of the rice crop over the next 15 years, the enslaved labor force they'll need to maintain productivity. Benjamin represents continuity, legacy, immortality through dynasty. They don't see the fragility in their dream. Don't recognize that building your future on other people's suffering makes that future inherently unstable. Don't understand that the very system that gave them Benjamin also created the conditions for his destruction. Benjamin makes a small sound in his sleep, not distress, just the ordinary noises of infancy. Catherine's hand stills on her embroidery. Jonathan looks up from his ledger. Both parents hold their breath until the baby settles again, reassured by his continued peace. This moment of shared anxiety, of mutual protectiveness, is as close as they'll ever come to genuine partnership. Their marriage was arranged, their relationship structured by duty and propriety more than affection. But Benjamin transforms them into co-conspirators in hope, united by desperate love for this small creature whose survival feels improbable and precious. Neither of them considers what it means that Sarah, the enslaved woman who saved Catherine's life, who attended Benjamin's birth, who keeps this family alive, remains property they could sell tomorrow if the price was right. Neither of them sees the collision approaching. Dr. Hayes sharpening his resentment into weapon. Sarah's reputation growing beyond anyone's control. Their son, perfect and vulnerable, positioned exactly where tragedy can strike. The pieces are arranging themselves with geometric precision. Discovery, descent, confrontation. The story's architecture is building toward inevitable catastrophe, and everyone involved is too close to see the pattern. In his Georgetown office, Hayes drafts a letter to a colleague in Charleston, discussing his concerns about unnatural healing practices among the enslaved population. In her cabin at Fairmont, Sarah adds another notch to her hidden piece of wood. 29 marks now. 29 lives saved. In the main house, Benjamin sleeps in his cradle, dreaming infant dreams, unaware that his existence has just become the fulcrum on which everything will turn. The night air carries the smell of jasmine and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, an enslaved person sings a work song that sounds like prayer. The rice fields reflect moonlight like broken mirrors. And the trap continues closing, slowly, inevitably, with the patience of people who believe God and society are on their side. April 1748. Benjamin Fairmont is 5 years old, and the fever comes on suddenly, the way childhood illnesses do. Fine at breakfast, burning by noon. Catherine finds him in the nursery, cheeks flushed red, skin hot to the touch. She calls for Betty, who calls for Jonathan, who sends immediately for Dr. Hayes. But she also, quietly, desperately, sends Betty to fetch Sarah from the quarters. Sarah arrives before the doctor. She examines Benjamin with hands that have touched hundreds of fevered foreheads, that have learned to read the language of illness through skin temperature and breathing patterns and the particular smell that different sicknesses produce. She presses gently on his neck, checking for swelling. Looks at his tongue. Asks Catherine about his appetite, his energy, whether he's complained of pain anywhere specific. Common fever, Sarah says finally, her voice calm in a way that makes Catherine's panic recede slightly. I've seen it dozens of times in the quarters. High fever for 3, maybe 4 days, then it breaks. He needs fluids, cool compresses, and this. She's already preparing a tea from herbs she carries in her pouch, steeping them in hot water brought from the kitchen. The tea smells of mint and something earthier. Sarah makes Benjamin drink half a cup, then instructs Betty on the exact schedule. Every 4 hours, plus cool cloths on his forehead and chest, plenty of water, no heavy blankets despite his shivering. By evening, Benjamin's fever has stabilized. Not gone, but not climbing. He sleeps fitfully but peacefully, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Sarah sits in the corner of the nursery, monitoring him with that intense observation that makes her seem almost otherworldly in her focus. Catherine watches her son breathe and feels hope, fragile, desperate hope that maybe this will be fine, that Sarah's gift will save him the way it saved everyone else. But in this moment of fragile hope, the true machinery of fear is already set in motion. A system that would rather see a child die than be saved by the wrong hands. Because what's at stake here isn't just Benjamin's life, it's the fundamental question of who gets to possess knowledge, who gets to wield authority, whose expertise society will recognize as legitimate. And that question, in 1748 South Carolina, has only one acceptable answer. Dr. Archibald Hayes arrives the next morning, his medical bag in hand, his expression already set in professional concern. He's dressed in his finest coat. This is the Fairmont family, after all, one of Georgetown's most prominent households. His entrance into the nursery carries the weight of institutional authority, 2 decades of practice, and an Edinburgh education. He finds Sarah sitting beside Benjamin's bed, preparing another dose of her tea. His face goes rigid. What is she doing here? Jonathan, who's been pacing in the hallway, enters behind Hayes. Catherine asked for her. The boy was burning up yesterday. Sarah's been treating him. Hayes sets his bag down with deliberate force. He examines Benjamin without speaking, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. Pulls back the boy's eyelids. Checks his pulse. Presses on his abdomen. The child whimpers but doesn't fully wake. The fever is high, Hayes pronounces, straightening. Dangerously high. The humors are severely imbalanced. We must bleed him immediately to release the corrupted blood before it spreads. Sarah's voice cuts through the room like a blade. No. The word hangs in the air, impossible and absolute. Hayes turns slowly, his face purpling. I beg your pardon. Sarah stands, and for the first time in 17 years at Fairmont, she speaks to white authority without deference, without the careful neutrality that keeps enslaved people alive. Because Benjamin is dying under Hayes's standard treatment before it's even begun, and she can see it coming with the clarity of someone who's watched this exact scenario kill children in the quarters over and over. The bleeding will weaken him, she says, voice shaking but clear. He needs his strength to fight the fever. He's already improving. Look at his breathing, how much steadier it is than yesterday. Please. And now she turns directly to Jonathan, breaking every protocol. Just continue what I've started. 3 more days and he'll recover. I've seen this fever before. I know what it does. I know how to treat it. The room goes absolutely silent. Hayes's voice, when he speaks, trembles with fury. You dare question my medical judgment? I studied at Edinburgh University. I have treated patients across 2 continents. And you, a slave woman with some Hedgewitch knowledge of weeds, presume to countermand my professional opinion. He turns to Jonathan, and his voice drops to something more dangerous than shouting. You must choose, sir. Either you trust my educated, professional treatment, or you trust her plantation superstitions. But you cannot have both. To continue with her remedies while rejecting my advice would be to publicly humiliate a respected physician. An insult that no gentleman could permit. An insult that I, certainly, could not overlook. The threat is unmistakable. Reject Hayes, and word will spread through Georgetown society. The Fairmonts will be marked as people who trust slaves over professionals, who elevate the wrong kind of knowledge, who've stepped outside the social contract that holds their world together. Jonathan looks at his son. Looks at Sarah. Looks at Dr. Hayes with his expensive coat and his Edinburgh diploma, and his 20 years of respected practice. He makes the only choice a man in his position can make. Sarah, return to the quarters. You're forbidden from entering the main house. His voice is flat, emptied of everything except the weight of social obligation. Sarah's eyes meet his for one long moment. In that look is everything she can't say aloud. You're killing your son. You know I can save him. You're choosing your reputation over his life. But she's property. Property doesn't argue with owners. She walks out of the nursery, past Catherine who's pressed against the wall with her hand over her mouth, past Betty who won't meet her eyes. Down the stairs, through the kitchen, across the yard to the quarters. Behind her, Dr. Hayes opens his medical bag and removes the bleeding instruments. Behind her, Benjamin whimpers in his sleep. Behind her, the choice has been made, and death has been invited into that nursery wearing the respectable coat of medical authority. The bleeding happens twice over the next 2 days. Hayes opens a vein in Benjamin's small arm, draining blood into a basin while explaining to Jonathan and Catherine that this will release the bad humors causing the fever. The child is already weak from 3 days of illness. The bleeding makes him weaker. His fever, which had stabilized under Sarah's care, begins climbing again. On the 3rd day, a rash appears across Benjamin's chest and back, small red spots that Hayes interprets as proof the bad humors are being expelled, evidence his treatment is working. He prescribes another bleeding, just to be thorough. Catherine sits beside her son's bed, holding his hand. It feels impossibly small in hers, and so hot it's almost painful to touch. Benjamin's eyes are glassy, unfocused. When she speaks to him, he doesn't respond. Just stares at the ceiling, breathing in shallow gasps. He'll be fine, Hayes assures her, packing his instruments. The crisis will break soon. These childhood fevers are always dramatic, but they pass. On the 4th day, Benjamin stops keeping down water. Catherine tries to give him sips from a cup, but he turns his head away, and what little gets into his mouth comes back up minutes later, tinged with bile. The main house has gone silent in that particular way that happens when everyone knows something terrible is unfolding, but no one will speak it aloud. The house slaves move through their duties like ghosts. Jonathan stays in his study, drinking. Catherine refuses to leave Benjamin's bedside. In the quarters, Sarah sits in her cabin with her head in her hands. She can feel it happening, that specific trajectory of childhood fever treated wrong, depleting the body's resources instead of supporting them. She knows Benjamin is dying. Knows exactly what's happening in that nursery, the stages of decline, the point of no return that he's probably already crossed. She can't do anything. She's forbidden from the main house. And even if she could enter, even if Catherine begged her to try again, Jonathan has made his choice. To reverse it now would be to admit he was wrong, that Hayes was wrong, that Benjamin's death could have been prevented. Men like Jonathan don't admit those kinds of mistakes. They double down. They find someone else to blame. On the 5th day, Benjamin's breathing changes. The rapid, shallow gasps slow down, become irregular. Catherine calls for Jonathan, her voice high and breaking. He comes running from his study, still holding his glass of whiskey. They stand on either side of the bed, watching their son's chest rise and fall with increasing difficulty. The rash has spread to his face now. His lips have gone pale, almost blue. His eyes are closed, but his eyelids flutter occasionally, as if he's trying to wake up but can't quite manage it. Dr. Hayes has been summoned, but he's attending another patient 20 miles away. Won't arrive until evening. Benjamin takes 3 more breaths. Then 2. Then 1. Then none. Catherine's scream tears through the house like something physical, like violence made into sound. It carries across the yard to the quarters, where enslaved people stop their work and bow their heads, because they know that sound. They know what it means when a mother loses a child. Jonathan stands frozen beside the bed, staring at his son's small, still body. His face has gone blank, emptied of everything except the hollow space where his future used to be. When Dr. Hayes finally arrives that evening, he examines Benjamin's body with professional detachment. Pulls back the sheets. Checks the rash. Nods slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. Malignant fever, he pronounces, closing his medical bag. A particularly virulent strain. Beyond any treatment's reach, I'm afraid. These childhood illnesses can turn deadly so quickly. Nothing anyone could have done. The lie sits in the room like poison gas. Catherine, her face swollen from hours of crying, doesn't respond. Can't respond. Can barely breathe through her grief. But Jonathan looks at Hayes and sees something shift in the doctor's expression. A flicker of defensiveness, of preemptive self-protection. Hayes is already constructing the narrative that will absolve him. Tragic but unavoidable, the child was doomed from the start. My treatment was correct even if the outcome was unfortunate. And in that moment, Jonathan's grief crystallizes into something harder. Something with sharp edges that needs a target. Benjamin is dead. Someone must be responsible. Dr. Hayes, with his Edinburgh education and his 20 years of respected practice, cannot be blamed. To blame Hayes would be to admit that Jonathan made the wrong choice, that he banished the person who could have saved his son in favor of someone whose treatments killed him. That admission is impossible. Psychologically impossible. Socially impossible. So Jonathan's mind, drowning in grief and rage and guilt that he cannot acknowledge, does what minds in his position always do. It finds someone else to blame. Sarah treated Benjamin first. Sarah's remedies were working when Hayes arrived. What if they weren't actually healing? What if they were poisoning? What if her entire practice has been something darker than medicine? The thought, once formed, spreads through his consciousness like ink through water. Downstairs, the house slaves are already preparing the body for burial, washing Benjamin's small form with gentle hands, dressing him in white clothes that make him look even smaller. In the quarters, Sarah sits on the floor of her cabin, rocking back and forth, grieving for a child she knew she could have saved if only they'd trusted her over their fear of what trusting her would mean. And in Georgetown, the whispers have already started. The Fairmont boy is dead. Died under Dr. Hayes's care, but after that slave woman treated him first. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Makes you question what exactly she was giving him. What kind of knowledge she really possesses. The funeral will be in 3 days. Half of Georgetown society will attend. And 3 days after that, Jonathan Fairmont will file formal charges that will put Sarah in a cell, awaiting execution for witchcraft and murder. The trap has sprung. The machinery of fear, built over centuries of hierarchy and prejudice and desperate need to preserve power, has found its victim. Benjamin is dead, and someone must burn for it. Jonathan Fairmont sits in the empty nursery, holding a piece of wood no longer than his hand. The notches catch the morning light, 33 vertical marks carved with deliberate precision. He found it during the search of Sarah's cabin, hidden beneath a loose floorboard along with dried herbs and a leather-bound notebook filled with drawings of plants and notes in handwriting that proves she can read and write, which is itself illegal. Benjamin's bed is still unmade. No one has touched it since they carried his body out 3 days ago. The sheets still hold the impression of his small form, a ghost pressed into fabric. Jonathan stares at that hollow space and feels his grief hardening into something with teeth. He needs this to be someone's fault. Not his. Not the choice he made to banish Sarah and trust Hayes. not the social hierarchy he upheld even as it killed his son. Someone else's fault. Someone who can be punished without threatening the foundations of everything he believes. Dr. Hayes arrives at the plantation that morning, uninvited but not unwelcome. He finds Jonathan in the nursery, still holding the notched wood. "What is that?" Hayes asks, though his tone suggests he already knows. "A record. Sarah kept it hidden. 33 marks. One for each person she treated." Jonathan's voice is hollow, scraped clean of everything except the need for answers that won't destroy him. Hayes takes the wood, examines it with the careful attention of someone building a case. Or 33 people she influenced. 33 souls she touched with whatever power she possesses. The word hangs in the air between them. Power. Hayes continues, his voice dropping to something conspiratorial, intimate. "I've been thinking about her success rate. It's unnaturally high, Jonathan. 3 physicians couldn't break the Thornton baby's fever, but she does it overnight? Samuel Hartwell suffered headaches for years under my care, but she cures him in weeks? Your wife was dying. I had exhausted every legitimate remedy, and Sarah appears and Catherine recovers. You said yourself her remedies worked," Jonathan says, but his voice wavers. "I said they appeared to work. But what if it was never about the remedies? What if her healing was something else? Something that required a price we didn't see being paid?" Hayes moves closer, and his voice becomes a blade wrapped in medical authority. "What if she was building influence, gathering power through each cure, and Benjamin, your son, was the payment finally demanded? The theory is insane, medically absurd. But it offers Jonathan exactly what he needs, a narrative where Benjamin's death wasn't caused by choosing Hayes over Sarah, but by Sarah herself. Where Jonathan's decision was right, and the tragedy came from forces beyond anyone's control. "She pleaded with me not to bleed him," Jonathan says quietly, remembering. "Of course she did. She needed to maintain the appearance of trying to save him while actually ensuring her remedies, her poisons, did their work. Think about it. Benjamin stabilized under her care, then declined precipitously when I began proper treatment. What does that suggest?" "It suggests your treatment killed him," a small voice in Jonathan's mind whispers. "But that voice is dangerous, so he silences it." "She deliberately caused his death," Jonathan says, testing the words, feeling how they fit. They fit well. They transform his guilt into righteous anger, his failure into victimhood. Hayes nods gravely. "I believe so. And I believe her earlier cures were either fortunate accidents or achieved through means that are unnatural, diabolical, even. The Church has long taught that Satan works through human instruments, often choosing society's most vulnerable to do his bidding. The pieces arrange themselves with terrible logic, an enslaved woman possessing knowledge exceeding trained physicians. Remedies that work too well to be natural. A record of influence kept hidden. Literacy that shouldn't exist. And a child who died after her touch." Jonathan stands, still holding the notched wood. "She practices witchcraft." "I believe she does," Hayes confirms. "And I believe Georgetown deserves to know the truth about what's been happening under our noses." 3 hours later, armed men arrive at Sarah's cabin. She's grinding herbs with her stone pestle when they enter, the morning routine she's performed for 17 years. She looks up and sees their faces. McLeese the overseer, 2 plantation overseers from neighboring properties, and Jonathan himself, standing in the doorway with something cold and final in his eyes. "Sarah, you're charged with practicing witchcraft and causing death through maleficium, harmful magic. You'll be taken to Georgetown for trial." She doesn't resist. What would be the point? She stands, sets down the pestle with careful precision, and extends her wrists for the shackles they're already bringing forward. As they lead her out, she sees the enslaved community watching from the fields, from cabin doorways, from the edges of the yard. Their faces are carefully blank, but their eyes hold everything they can't say. We know this is wrong. We know you're innocent. We can't help you. Thomas stands near the rice mill, his healed hand clenched into a fist. Betty watches from the main house kitchen window. Others whose lives Sarah saved over 17 years stand frozen, terror and grief warring on their faces. Sarah meets their eyes one by one as she passes. Not saying goodbye. Saying, remember. Remember that I healed you. Remember that this accusation is a lie. Remember that systems built on injustice will always sacrifice the innocent to preserve themselves. They shackle her in the wagon. Unnecessary cruelty, since she's made no attempt to flee. Jonathan watches from his study window as they drive away, taking with them the woman who saved his wife, delivered his son, and kept his household alive for nearly 2 decades. He's holding the notched wood like evidence, like proof, like the thing that will finally let him sleep without seeing Benjamin's face. Dr. Hayes stands beside him, already composing the pamphlet he'll publish about this case, an account of witchcraft in the Carolina Low Country, that will establish his reputation as an expert on supernatural matters and ensure no one questions why his treatments failed while a slave woman succeeded. And Sarah rides toward Georgetown in chains, knowing that truth won't save her. That justice was never designed to protect people like her. That she's about to be tried, convicted, and executed not for what she did, but for what her success revealed about the fragility of white authority. The wagon rolls through the gates. Behind them, at Fairmont Plantation, Benjamin's empty nursery waits like an accusation no one will answer. The Georgetown Courthouse sits on Front Street, a brick building that's supposed to represent civilization's triumph over wilderness. 2 stories, with large windows designed to let in light, and a courtroom on the 2nd floor that can hold about 80 people when packed tight. On May 28, 1748, it holds at least 120. They've come from across 3 counties, plantation owners, merchants, their wives dressed in imported fabrics, doctors and lawyers and ministers who view this trial as both entertainment and civic duty. The heat is suffocating. Georgetown in late May feels like breathing through wet cloth, and this many bodies packed into one room transforms the air into something thick enough to choke on. Sarah sits in a straight-backed chair facing the magistrate's bench, iron shackles on her wrists that weigh maybe 10 pounds each. The metal has already rubbed her skin raw, leaving dark marks that will scar if she lives long enough for scars to matter. She's wearing the same gray dress she was arrested in 5 days ago. No one has offered her fresh clothes or the opportunity to wash. The magistrate is Thomas Wainwright, a wealthy rice planter who serves in this position because it confers social status, not because he has any legal training. Beside him sits Dr. Hayes as expert witness, and a minister named Reverend Cotton who will provide theological guidance on matters of witchcraft and demonic influence. The enslaved people who've been summoned to testify stand against the back wall, separate from white observers. They're not allowed to sit. Thomas is there, his healed hand hanging at his side. Betty stands near the door, her eyes fixed on the floor. Others whose lives Sarah saved watch with the terrible knowledge that their testimony will be used against her no matter what they actually say. Magistrate Wainwright calls the proceedings to order by striking his gavel, 3 sharp cracks that silence the murmuring crowd. The accused, Sarah, property of Jonathan Fairmont, stands charged with practicing witchcraft and causing death through diabolical arts. Specifically, the death of Benjamin Fairmont, age 5 years, on or about May 1st of this year. How does the accused respond? Sarah isn't permitted to speak in her own defense. Slaves can't give testimony against white citizens. But Wainwright has asked anyway, perhaps out of some vestigial sense of fairness, perhaps just for show. I healed people, Sarah says, her voice clear despite 5 days without adequate food or water. Every plant has properties. Every illness has patterns. There's no magic in it. Only attention. That is precisely what a witch would claim, Reverend Cotton interjects, leaning forward. Satan's instruments always deny their master's hand. The first testimony comes from Dr. Hayes. He stands, adjusts his waistcoat, and delivers his account with the careful authority of a man who's rehearsed these words. He describes Sarah's treatments as uncanny in their effectiveness, notes that she possessed knowledge beyond what an uneducated slave could naturally acquire, and presents the notched wood as evidence of her keeping count of souls influenced. Benjamin Fairmont showed signs of improvement under her care, then declined precipitously when proper medical treatment began. This suggests her remedies created a dependence, a corruption in the child's body that made him vulnerable once they were withdrawn. Or worse, that she deliberately poisoned him to punish Mr. Fairmont for some perceived slight. It's a masterpiece of misdirection. Hayes transforms his own failed treatment into evidence against Sarah, turns Benjamin's death under his care into proof of her malice. Rebecca Thornton testifies next. She describes how Sarah saved her infant son in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Under questioning from Wainwright, she admits that yes, she found Sarah's ability uncanny. Yes, she wondered where such knowledge came from. Yes, looking back, it did seem strange that Sarah succeeded where multiple trained physicians failed. Each admission, intended as praise for Sarah's skill, becomes evidence of her otherworldly power. Then they call Thomas. He walks to the front of the courtroom with his head down, and you can see the conflict tearing him apart. Sarah saved his hand. Saved his ability to work, which means saved his life, because an enslaved person who can't work is sold or killed. He owes her everything. But if he defends her, he dies too. Simple as that. Tell the court about your injury, Wainwright instructs. Thomas describes the infected wound, how it turned black, how McLeese noted it but did nothing. Then Sarah's treatment, the plants, the poultice, the miraculous healing. And did she ever say anything about where her knowledge came from? Wainwright asks. Thomas hesitates. In that pause, you can feel the weight of impossible choices. Tell the truth, that Sarah learned from her mother, that this is traditional knowledge passed down generations, and they'll call it evidence of occult lineage. Lie to help her, and they'll punish both of you. She said. Thomas's voice cracks. She said she learned from plants. From watching. From watching what? Reverend Cotton presses. The natural world. Or something else. Did she ever perform rituals? Speak in unknown tongues? Call upon spirits? No, Thomas's voice is barely audible. She knew plants. It's not enough to save her, but it's all he can give without destroying himself. He returns to the back wall, and Sarah catches his eye for just a second. She nods, a gesture that says, I understand. You did what you had to do. I don't blame you. Betty is called next, and this is the testimony that breaks something in the room. She's terrified. You can see it in every line of her body, the way her hands shake, how her eyes dart between Sarah and the magistrate, the sweat on her face that's not entirely from the heat. She's been told what happens if she doesn't cooperate. She'll be sold south, to the sugar plantations where life expectancy is measured in months, not years. Tell the court about Sarah's behavior in the main house, Wainwright says. Betty's voice trembles. She was always watching, always looking at things close. Miss Catherine, she got better after Sarah treated her, but, She pauses, and you can see her making the calculation. Save herself, or save Sarah. Only one of them survives this. But it seemed strange. Like Miss Catherine was under some kind of influence. The word lands like a stone in water, ripples spreading outward. Did Sarah ever speak to you about her treatments? About where her knowledge came from? She had a pouch around her neck with things in it, roots and such. She'd talk to it sometimes, like praying, but not to God. It's a lie, or a truth stretched so far it becomes falsehood. Sarah did pray over her remedies, but prayers to the Christian God, mixed with traditional invocations her mother taught her, languages that white people don't recognize, so they call demonic instead of different. Betty won't look at Sarah as she testifies. Can't. The shame is too enormous to face directly. The room is sweltering now. Sweat runs down faces. Powdered wigs droop. Women fan themselves with increasing desperation. But no one leaves. This is too compelling. Watching a slave condemned for the crime of competence, watching the social order reassert itself after being threatened by someone who forgot her place. The iron on Sarah's wrists has grown warm from her body heat. The shackles weigh on her like the accumulated weight of every system designed to keep her powerless. Around the courtroom, enslaved observers stand frozen, bearing witness to what happens when one of them rises too high. The magistrate confers with Reverend Cotton in whispers. Dr. Hayes looks satisfied, his reputation secured by transforming his failure into her crime. And Sarah sits in her chair, surrounded by lies that sound like truth, knowing that the verdict was decided before the trial ever began. Knowing that in this courtroom, in this moment, justice is whatever protects power and punishes those who threaten it. The air is thick with more than heat now. It's heavy with the weight of moral choices made under impossible conditions, with the knowledge that sometimes truth is powerless against systems that demand sacrifice. Outside, the sun beats down on Georgetown. Inside, the machinery of fear grinds forward, converting one woman's gift into evidence of evil, her healing hands into instruments of Satan. The verdict is coming. Everyone in the room knows what it will be. The verdict comes on May 28, 1748, after less than 3 hours of deliberation that was really just 3 hours of formality. Everyone in the courthouse knew the outcome before the trial began. The only question was what form the punishment would take. Magistrate Thomas Wainwright stands, the room falling silent except for the sound of someone's fan clicking open and shut, a nervous rhythm that underscores the moment. The accused, Sarah, has been found guilty of practicing witchcraft and employing diabolical arts to cause harm, specifically resulting in the death of Benjamin Fairmont, aged 5 years. The evidence presented, her unnatural knowledge, her suspicious success where trained physicians failed, her secret records and forbidden literacy, all point to powers derived from sources contrary to God's law. Sarah sits motionless in her chair, the iron shackles heavy on her wrists. Her face shows nothing. Not fear, not anger, not even resignation. Just that same quality of intense observation she's always possessed, watching this final act of her destruction with the same attention she gave to fevered children and infected wounds. Wainwright continues, and his voice takes on a tone of rehearsed mercy. However, the court is not without compassion. We recognize that the accused may have been an unwitting instrument of darker forces. Therefore, rather than death by burning, the traditional sentence for witchcraft, we render a judgment of mercy. The word mercy hangs in the stifling air like poison. The instruments of her crimes, her hands, which mixed the potions and performed the unnatural healings, shall be rendered incapable of further harm. 20 lashes to each palm, administered with a cane of sufficient weight to ensure permanent damage to the tendons and bones. She will live, but she will never again practice her arts. A murmur runs through the crowd. Some nod approval at this supposed clemency. Others look uncomfortable but say nothing, because to object would be to question the court's wisdom, to align yourself with a convicted witch. Catherine Fairmont sits in the front row beside her husband, and the color drains from her face so completely she looks like a corpse in expensive clothing. Her hands clutch at Jonathan's arm, fingernails digging into the fabric of his coat. He doesn't seem to notice. The sentence is carried out in the courthouse square an hour later, to ensure maximum public witness. They bind Sarah's wrists to an iron post, palms facing upward, fingers forced open and tied to prevent her from making fists. The executioner is a thick-armed man named Dalton who normally handles plantation discipline, whippings, brandings, the routine violence that maintains order. He's been given a wooden cane, 2 inches thick, hardwood that will shatter bone as easily as it tears flesh. The first blow lands on Sarah's right palm with a sound like a branch breaking. The crowd flinches. Sarah doesn't. Her face remains absolutely still, jaw set, eyes fixed on some point in the distance that only she can see. The only indication she feels anything is the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her breathing shifts to something more deliberate. The second blow. The third. By the fifth, blood is running down her arm, pooling at the iron post. By the 10th, the bones in her fingers have clearly broken. You can see the unnatural angles, the way they won't lie flat anymore. She doesn't scream, doesn't cry out, doesn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they've broken anything except flesh and bone. Her silence is more powerful than any sound could be, a refusal to participate in her own destruction, a withholding of the one thing they want most, evidence that they've hurt her. 20 blows to the right hand. Then they move to the left. In the crowd, Thomas turns away, shoulders shaking. Betty stares at the ground, tears streaming silently down her face. Other enslaved people who came to witness stand frozen, bearing testimony to what their world does to those who rise above their assigned station. Catherine Fairmont vomits into her handkerchief, then collapses. Jonathan catches her, signals for their carriage. As they carry her away, she's sobbing, great, racking sobs that shake her entire frame. She hasn't stopped crying since Benjamin died, but these tears are different. These are tears that acknowledge complicity, that recognize her own role in this horror, that understand she helped destroy the woman who saved her life. She'll never fully recover. The guilt will eat at her like disease, keeping her bedridden for months, then years, transforming her into a ghost who haunts the Fairmont house but never truly lives in it again. By the time they're finished, Sarah's hands are ruined, crushed. The delicate bones that allowed such precise work with herbs and poultices are shattered into fragments. The tendons that gave her hands their careful grace are torn beyond any possibility of healing. The skin is split open in a dozen places, blood and exposed tissue visible beneath. She'll never hold a mortar and pestle again. Never tie knots for bandages. Never perform the intricate work that healing requires. The gift that took years to develop, that saved 33 lives by her count and countless more uncounted, has been destroyed in 40 minutes of methodical violence. They untie her and she slumps against the post, finally allowing her body to show what her face refused to reveal. Pain beyond description, loss beyond measure. Her hands hang useless at her sides, already swelling to twice their normal size, the fingers bent at impossible angles. Dr. Hayes watches from the courthouse steps, his expression satisfied. He's successfully eliminated his competition and secured his reputation. In 6 months, he'll publish his pamphlet about this case and be celebrated as an expert on supernatural threats. Reverend Cotton offers a prayer thanking God for protecting the community from evil influences. His words float over the square, pious and hollow. And Sarah, her hands destroyed, her gift stolen, her life reduced to whatever Jonathan Fairmont decides her broken body is worth, maintains her silence. That profound, powerful silence that says, "You can destroy my hands. You can destroy my body. But you cannot destroy what I know, what I've proven, what I represent." They drag her back to the jail cell. The crowd disperses, some satisfied justice was served, others uncomfortable with what they've witnessed but unwilling to name their discomfort as complicity. The sun continues its arc across the Carolina sky, indifferent to human cruelty. The rice fields continue their profitable production. The machinery of slavery and hierarchy and fear continues grinding forward. And one woman's gift, carefully developed over years of observation and practice, deployed with precision and care to heal the sick and ease suffering, has been crushed into broken bones and torn flesh because it threatened men who couldn't tolerate being shown inadequate. This is the catharsis, if you can call it that. Not justice. Not redemption. Just the grim satisfaction of a system reasserting its power by destroying anyone who challenges it. Jonathan Fairmont sits in his study 2 weeks after the sentencing, the leather-bound plantation ledger open before him. His handwriting has grown shakier lately. Too much whiskey, too little sleep, too many ghosts occupying the rooms of his house. Catherine hasn't left her bed since the sentencing. She lies in their room with curtains drawn, refusing food, speaking to no one. The doctor, a new one from Charleston, not Hayes, says it's melancholia brought on by grief. But Jonathan knows it's something deeper. Guilt has teeth, and it's eating his wife alive. He dips his quill in ink and writes with the cold precision of a man conducting business. June 15, 1748. The slave woman Sarah, previously noted for herbal knowledge, having been convicted of witchcraft and rendered permanently incapable of labor requiring manual dexterity, has been sold to trader Moses Garrett for transport to Louisiana frontier. Sale price, £45. Loss absorbed as unavoidable consequence of criminal proceedings. That's it. That's how 17 years of service, 33 lives saved, and one woman's systematic destruction gets recorded. A ledger entry. An administrative note. A financial transaction that erases the entire human tragedy by reducing it to pounds and shillings. He signs his name below the entry with a flourish, closes the ledger, and pours himself another brandy. Moses Garrett is known for purchasing damaged goods, enslaved people too injured or sick to fetch premium prices at regular auctions, but still capable of some labor on the brutal Louisiana sugar plantations where life expectancy is measured in months. He'll take Sarah West, sell her to someone who needs field hands and doesn't care that her hands are mangled beyond use for anything requiring precision. She'll die there, probably within a year. Everyone knows it. Jonathan knows it. This is exile and death sentence combined, dressed up as a business transaction. This is the true horror. Not a monster in the dark. Not a supernatural threat. Just a man in a sunlit study who can destroy a life and call it business. Who can purchase a human being, benefit from her gifts for 17 years, then crush those gifts when they become inconvenient and sell what's left to die slowly in a Louisiana swamp. This is what they buried. What they wanted erased from official records. What Georgetown society agreed to forget because remembering would mean confronting their own complicity. But some stories refuse to stay buried. Some truths demand to be heard, even centuries later. Remember this. Remember that Sarah's crime was competence. That her punishment was survival. That the system destroyed her not because she failed, but because she succeeded too well. Remember it. 3 months after Sarah disappears into Moses Garrett's wagon train heading west, strange things begin happening at Fairmont Plantation. The rice crop fails in one section of fields. McLeese investigates and finds the trunk gates sabotaged, Someone with intimate knowledge of rice cultivation has allowed salt water to flood the paddies at precisely the wrong time, destroying months of growth. A fire starts in the seed storage barn, consuming next year's planting rice. The cause is never determined, but the burn pattern suggests multiple ignition points, as if someone set it deliberately. Tools go missing. Fences collapse. Horses fall lame with mysterious ailments that no veterinarian can diagnose or treat. The enslaved community at Fairmont works with that same deliberate inefficiency that's impossible to punish because it leaves no clear evidence. Not rebellion, that would bring violent retribution. Just a collective withdrawal of care, a quiet refusal to invest energy in the plantation's success. Georgetown society begins whispering about a curse. The Fairmonts are marked, they say, touched by something dark that followed them home from that witchcraft trial. Their prosperity is draining away like water through cupped hands. But there's no curse. Or rather, the curse is simpler and more mundane than supernatural vengeance. They destroyed the person who kept them healthy. Sarah treated enslaved workers when they got sick, preventing small illnesses from becoming epidemics. She advised on water quality, on food storage, on basic sanitation that made the difference between survival and death in Carolina's brutal climate. Without her, people who would have recovered now die. Minor ailments become major. The careful knowledge that sustained the plantation's productivity is simply gone, and no one else possesses it. Dr. Hayes raises his rates. After all, demand for his services has increased now that the alternative is gone. His practice thrives even as the Fairmont fortune declines. Jonathan drinks more. Catherine withdraws further from the world, becoming a pale ghost who drifts through the house touching Benjamin's toys, sitting in empty rooms, waiting for death that's taking its time arriving. The plantation limps forward, less profitable each year, hemorrhaging money and people and the vitality that once made it one of Georgetown's premier properties. By 1755, Jonathan will be forced to sell off sections of land to cover debts. By 1760, he'll sell half his enslaved workforce. By 1765, the Fairmont name will be spoken with pity rather than respect, a cautionary tale about families that fall from grace. But no one, not Jonathan, not Hayes, not Georgetown society, will ever acknowledge the real reason for their decline. They destroyed the very knowledge that sustained them. They crushed a gift under iron and ignorance, then wondered why prosperity fled. The ledger sits closed in Jonathan's study, that final entry about Sarah preserved in his precise handwriting. An administrative note. A business transaction. A human being reduced to pounds sterling and transported west to die. This is how atrocity gets recorded in official histories. In the language of commerce and law. In words that erase humanity and replace it with property values. But the truth remains, buried in that ledger entry like a seed waiting to germinate. They destroyed her because she was brilliant. Because she threatened the hierarchy that placed educated white men above everyone else. Because her success revealed the lie at the heart of their world, that power and knowledge flow from God-given natural order rather than from systemic violence and exploitation. They couldn't tolerate that revelation. So they destroyed the messenger and called it justice. The sun sets over Fairmont Plantation. The rice fields reflect orange light like broken mirrors. Somewhere far to the west, Sarah rides in chains toward Louisiana, her hands wrapped in filthy bandages, her gift stolen but her knowledge intact. And in his study, Jonathan Fairmont pours another brandy and tries not to think about the choices that led him here. To an empty nursery, a dying wife, a declining fortune, and a ledger full of entries that document prosperity built on other people's bones. The page turns. The ink dries. The story, officially, is over. But some stories don't end when the ledger closes. Some truths refuse to die just because they're inconvenient. And Sarah's story, the impossible mystery of her survival, her gift, and what happened next, is just beginning. There's no gravestone for Sarah. No marker in any Georgetown cemetery. No official record of her death or where her body might rest. The plantation ledgers track her sale to Moses Garrett in June 1748, and then, nothing. She disappears from written history as completely as if she never existed. But here's what the official records miss. Stories don't need paper to survive. In the slave quarters across the Carolina Lowcountry, Sarah's story passed from mouth to ear like contraband, carried in whispers and coded songs, preserved in the oral histories that enslaved people maintained because written records were weapons their oppressors controlled. Grandmothers told granddaughters. Old men taught young boys. The story traveled through networks of communication that white society never fully understood, spreading across plantations and state lines and generations. They called her different names in different tellings, sometimes Sarah, sometimes the healer woman, sometimes just the one they couldn't break. But the core remained constant, a woman with a gift for healing. 33 lives saved. Hands destroyed for the crime of competence. Sold west to die. And then, depending on who tells the story, one of two endings. In some versions, Sarah dies on the journey to Louisiana. The infection in her crushed hands spreads despite treatment, or fever takes her, or she simply gives up after watching everything she built get systematically destroyed. Moses Garrett buries her in an unmarked grave somewhere along the trading route, one more anonymous death among thousands. Her knowledge dies with her, lost forever because the world wasn't ready to preserve what she offered. But other versions, the ones told with particular weight in certain communities, suggest something different. They say Sarah survived the journey. Say her hands healed enough to perform basic work, though she'd never again achieve the precision her gift required. Say she was sold to a Louisiana plantation where she kept her head down and her knowledge quiet, because drawing attention had nearly killed her once already. And they say, these versions that sound more like hope than history, that she found students. Young enslaved women who showed aptitude for healing, who possessed that same quality of intense observation, who could be trusted with knowledge that was simultaneously life-saving and dangerous. Sarah couldn't use her hands anymore, but she could teach, could describe plants and their properties, could explain the patterns of illness and the logic of treatment, could pass forward everything she'd learned through observation and practice and years of careful attention. In this version, her legacy doesn't die with her broken hands. It scatters like seeds, taking root in other minds, other communities, other places where enslaved people needed healing and couldn't access white doctors who charged money they didn't have. Which version is true? The historical record can't tell us. Moses Garrett's manifests don't track individuals once they're sold. Louisiana plantation records from that era are fragmentary at best, destroyed by time and floods and the deliberate erasure that characterized so much of slavery's documentation. But here's what we know for certain. Traditional African healing knowledge survived slavery. Herbal medicine practiced by enslaved communities was documented throughout the South. Techniques passed down through generations despite systematic efforts to suppress any knowledge that empowered enslaved people. Midwives and healers and herbalists continued their work in quarters and back rooms and secret places where white authority couldn't fully penetrate. Sarah was part of that tradition. Whether she lived long enough to teach others or died on the road to Louisiana, her story became part of the collective memory that sustained enslaved communities through centuries of trauma. She became proof that brilliance existed even in chains. That gifts couldn't be entirely crushed even when hands were broken. That some truths survive in memory even when erased from official records. Her unmarked grave, wherever it is, whether in Louisiana or along some forgotten trading route or in a corner of a plantation cemetery whose records no longer exist, contains more than one woman's bones. It holds the testament to what happens when systems built on hierarchy encounter competence in the wrong people. When fear of exposure drives the powerful to destroy rather than acknowledge their own inadequacy. Georgetown society moved on. Dr. Hayes published his pamphlet and died respected. Jonathan Fairmont's fortune declined, but his name remained prominent until his death in 1768. Catherine lived until 1772, a ghost in her own house, never recovering from the grief that consumed her after Benjamin's death and Sarah's destruction. None of them faced earthly justice for what they did. The system that enabled Sarah's persecution continued for another century, then transformed into new systems of oppression that carried forward the same fundamental logic. Some people matter. Others don't. And those who forget their place must be reminded, violently if necessary. But in the quarters, in the hidden spaces, in the oral histories preserved by people whose stories were considered too unimportant to write down, there, justice of a different kind occurred. Memory became resistance. Story became survival. The preservation of truth became an act of defiance against oblivion. Some truths are not recorded in ledgers, but in memory. Some justice is not found in courts, but in the stories we refuse to let die. Sarah's story survived because people decided it mattered. Because they chose to remember when forgetting would have been easier. Because they understood that every act of bearing witness, every retelling, every whispered account passed from generation to generation, was a small victory against the machinery of erasure. Sarah existed. She healed people. She was brilliant. She was destroyed for threatening hierarchy. And her story matters, not just as history, but as warning and testament and proof that some gifts survive even the most determined attempts to crush them. Join us in remembering. Because every story preserved is an act of resistance. Every truth spoken is a refusal of the silence they demanded. And somewhere, in an unmarked grave or scattered across generations of students we'll never name, Sarah's knowledge persists. Waiting to be recognized. Refusing to die. Remember her. What do you think of this story? Leave your comment below and tell me what you think about this complex story of power. If you found this exploration of a hidden scandal compelling, if it made you think about how power operates and who pays the price when the powerful seek to protect themselves, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates history's darker truths. The past is never as simple as we wish it were. And the stories that make us most uncomfortable are often the ones most worth remembering because they teach us something essential about human nature and the structures of power that shape all our lives. See you in the next video.